Welcome to Leaders and Legends, the podcast focused on leadership and clinical trial execution. I'm your host, Patty Lushton, CEO of Diligent Pharma. In each episode, we'll get to know the individuals who are driving change and influencing the direction of our industry. Whether you're a seasoned executive yourself, an emerging leader, or simply passionate about clinical trials like I am, join us as we discuss our industry's most pressing challenges, the future of clinical trials, and hear insights and advice from the leaders who are moving our industry forward. John, thank you so much for being on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Patty, it is my pleasure. It's great to talk to you again.
Well, you know, when I had this idea to do a podcast called Leaders and Legends, you were the first person that I wrote down in terms of like, who would I want to talk to? And
Thank you.
and it took a while, obviously, because you're a busy man and you've been traveling all over the world, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about. But, you know, I was thinking back, I think we met when you were the president of ICON, or you were just sort of transitioning into that role. And that must have been 20 years ago. Is that about right?
At least. At least.
Okay.
I started at ICON in 1999.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know, some people would get to that kind of, you know, point in their career and think, wow, what a trajectory. You know, I've gotten to be president of one of the most influential, biggest CROs in the world, but it seemed like you were just getting started at that point, right?
Well,
So you went on to walk us through your journey from ICON to what you're doing now.
so I was at ICON for 11 and a half years, and it was an incredible experience, one of the best in my whole career as I kind of look back at things. And I was recruited by Bill Taff, and we all know Bill. And
Yeah, a mutual friend.
he was a great boss. And I also interviewed with Peter Gray, who was at the time the CFO of the company, and John Climax, who was CEO of the company at that time, and Ronan Lamb, who was chairman of the board. And Ronan and John were the founders of the company, and real visionaries. I mean, basically, I think all of the leaders who built sustained CROs to what they are today were really visionaries on what the industry could become. But at that time, ICON was actually pretty small. We were public, and we were doing about
Right.
$85 million a year, and I think we had about 400 employees worldwide. So we were, as some people said, we were punching way above our body weight, which I think gave a lot of angst to quintiles, because we oftentimes went head to head with them, and a few times we beat them, and we were substantially smaller.
So talk about the decision to then join Pfizer as the worldwide head of clinical development operations. What was the thinking there?
So I started my career in pharma, in big pharma, back in 1985. I was with a very large German pharmaceutical chemical company called Herx. And I was part of the U.S. business unit, which was Herx-Roussel, which later became Herx-Marion-Roussel, and down the road is now Sanofi. And I loved my tenure at Herx. It was kind of my formative years, because I started out as a bench scientist in cardiovascular research, and I loved it. I ended up having a couple of labs that I was responsible for. But I had a great mentor, Victor Bauer, who was the president of the company. And about every 3 years, he would call me and say, it's time to move on, time to do something else. And so, I made the move out of preclinical and drug discovery into clinical pharmacology, which was a great transition, because it gave me the opportunity to actually follow a drug that I worked on in the lab into the clinic and see what happens when it actually goes into human beings.
Yeah.
And then from there, I went into project management and portfolio management for the company, which gave me a viewpoint into commercial, but also, kept me well connected with R&D. So that was, that was the foundation of everything. But what it taught me is you can move around. It's okay to move
Yeah.
around, and it's actually good. So the change didn't scare me when we merged, and I ended up making the move into the CRO industry, starting with Par Excel. And it's, I guess, a part of me always wanted to go back to pharma.
Yeah.
And the opportunity with Pfizer was kind of incredible
Mm.
because they were going through just tremendous change as an organization. And, they had just bought Wyeth. They had expanded their portfolio to be large and small molecules, biologics, cancer, oncology products, vaccines. And so it seemed like a really, really good opportunity. It was a hard decision to leave Pfizer. And, it's companies continued to do exceptionally well. And we ended up working together when they were an alliance partner. And they're
Hmm.
continuing to work with Pfizer, which is great. So that was a sustained relationship. But I will tell you, I was a bit anxious making the change. Um, going back to pharma after that many years, and basically doing what was the largest sort of transformation in the industry at the time. So it was great. I enjoyed
Yeah.
it. It was stressful, but I think a lot of times you don't really know what you're capable of until you really stretch yourself. And with Icon, over an 11 and a half year period, we were growing about 25% a year. And so we went from, I think, the 12th largest CRO to the fifth. And I think now they're either number one or number two. So I felt like, I had put in a really, really good foundation for the company. Peter Gray and I are the same age, so I didn't think he was going anywhere.
Hmm.
So it seemed like a good time to go back to pharma and be part of, a huge transformation. And then that opened the door for things like TransCelerate and, City and some of the other initiatives that were industry initiatives with you, with the
Yeah.
Quality Consortium.
Right.
So yeah, it opened up a lot of neat things, but it was not an easy decision. It was one I thought a lot about. So
Yeah.
glad I did it.
Well, I do have a memory of meeting with you in your offices in New York at Pfizer. And it was when our research had just come out on the state of the industry as it pertained to quality of clinical trials,
Right.
right? And the data was provocative, and um, you could kind of think of it as somewhat disturbing because the scores were very low from the sponsor side in terms of just their perceptions of quality. And I was struck that you also felt concerned and perturbed by this data, and you were on board with wanting to do something about it. And we talked a little bit about this idea of making progress through collaboration. And I see you as somebody who really sort of dives into issues in a way, and you get involved in a lot of initiatives. So can you talk a little bit about that? Your involvement in all the collaboratives, and just kind of what is it that you're kind of inspired or motivated by? Because it feels like you take things very seriously in terms of industry challenges and problems.
Well, I think, the experiences I've had in the industry, starting out in research and actually watching, the development process, and a lot of improvements have been made. I mean, clearly, I go back to the days where we didn't even have electronic data capture. We were still collecting data on case report forms and carrying paper all over the country.
Yeah, I was
Uh,
part of that history as well.
yeah, yeah. And
Right.
so, that
Sticky
was a
sticky notes.
massive,
Yeah.
exactly. That was a massive step change in improving data quality, the speed of development, but there's still a lot more to do. And I think sometimes what happens is, there's so much pressure in the industry to go fast. Um, the loss of exclusivity of assets, you can't spend too much time, you can't chew up too much of your patent. We see that it takes longer for products to get to peak sales today than it compared to the way it was, 20 years ago. And there's a lot of other pressures, right? I mean, we've gone from an industry that was most revered and admired to one that, is they're throwing rocks at us some of the time in terms
Yeah.
of, the cost of drugs. So, I see areas where things need to be improved, and quality is at a it's at the foundation. And I've seen what happens when, things are not paid attention to or overlooked in the process, and they really come back to bite you later on. And when I was at Pfizer, we had received a warning letter, and that's free, it was common information at the time. And so there was a huge focus on improving quality all the way from the beginning. And that's a huge effort with quality by design activities. So we were in the very early stages. Briggs Morrison,
Oh, yeah.
Colleen Glessner, Bill Earhart, in the quality by design effort. And we worked really closely with the FDA. And, if there was a silver lining in getting a warning letter, one of the silver linings is you work extremely closely with the FDA in a collaborative way to make things better and to improve quality. And I'm happy to say, one of the legacies, I guess, of my time at Pfizer was we really improved the quality process there. Deb Driscoll was another partner,
Yeah.
and so, that was important to have that focus and support. And we had that all the way up at the top, with Ian Reed, who was the CEO at the time, and Michael Dolston, who was my president, or who was president of R&D and my boss. So that helps a lot when you have that level of commitment. And I also worked really closely with Patricia Cavazzoni. So, that's an incredible experience to be able to work with, people like that, John Ointman, really high quality people who are very committed to quality and the quality process. And, if you get it right in the beginning, you're going to have a good product and quality out at the other end. It makes it a lot easier for the FDA when they come in to do their, their inspections and pre-approval inspections. So, I saw pretty early on that was an area that you really had to make sure was rock solid in the development process.
Yeah. And when we first started talking about the Evoca Quality Consortium, you were also on board with not keeping things a secret, that quality should not necessarily be competitive, right? That you and your team were working through a lot and
That's
you were
right.
willing to share.
Yeah. And
And yeah,
it
talk
was
about
great.
that
I
a little
mean,
bit.
yeah, I mean, that period of time was really special, both with the Quality Consortium and also TransCelerate,
Yes.
because, to have 10 major pharmaceutical companies collaborating with each other on how to do things better, how to have more quality, sharing experiences. It's like, don't do this because you don't want to have this experience, and learning from it together. It was pretty special during that period of time, because prior to that, that information was often held very tightly and it wasn't shared across the industry. So those, between the quality consortium that you put together and TransCelerate's efforts, it really opened up what I consider to be a super critical dialogue among R&D leaders. And I think really helped advance things across the industry, so that we have a better platform now to do some of these other initiatives to accelerate. So you
Yes.
have to have a good, solid quality foundation before you start accelerating. If you accelerate without that, bad things can happen. So I
Right.
think that really helped a lot, that sharing period.
Well, Victor Bauer must have been in your head when you decided to leave Pfizer and take on the role of CEO at BioClinica, right? Your mentor pushing you along to try new things. So, talk a little bit about that shift to going to a company like
That
BioClinica.
one was a little more challenging, because I think it was partly Vic, but also Father Time, because I was starting to get up close to 60, and it's still young, but starting to evaluate, have I done all the things that I want to do in the industry? And one of the things that I hadn't done, and I had been approached several times, was to run a private equity backed company and to gain experience in that environment. So I'd worked for a public company, I'd worked for a large public, CRO, public pharmaceutical company, um, but I hadn't been in the private environment with a PE backed company. And I knew BioClinica. I knew it by the founder, who was Jim Conklin. And back then, it was had a different name, but
Yeah.
um,
No, this is blasts from the past,
oh
John.
yeah,
All these names that you're bringing up are people
oh
that I've
yeah. So
dealt with.
Jim's a good friend, and
Yeah.
he built an incredible company. Again, he was way ahead of his time. He saw in the future what was going to happen and how medical imaging was going to be used to produce primary endpoints that would then accelerate the approval, particularly of oncology drugs. Because prior to that, it was all around overall survival, which could take 5 years, 10 years to get enough data. And once we were able to use objective endpoints, like progression-free survival, or measuring tumor regression, and that kind of thing, and it's expanded well since then. Um, and the FDA was supportive. They came out with a governance document and guidance document back in probably the mid 2000s. Let's say about 2006, I think, was when it came out, or 2007. That helps drive that process. So I always had a real interest in technology, and particularly imaging, and how imaging could be used, and how it can even do more once you start getting into digital pathology and moving in that direction. So, um, when the opportunity came up, I thought, well, it's either probably now or never.
Yeah.
Because I thought if I didn't do this opportunity, I probably would have just stayed at Pfizer, another 3 to 5 years, and then probably, called it a day. But this opportunity checked all the boxes for me. I didn't have to commute a lot. They were based in Pennsylvania. It was about an hour drive from my house, so it wasn't a big deal. I knew a lot of the people that were there because we had worked with BioClinica a lot. Even at Pfizer, we had a lot of work that we were giving to BioClinica, and so I went there.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's
so, um, and that was an interesting experience because it was going back to a much smaller company. And I remember having an interview with both JLL and Water Street. Both private equity firms had roughly 50-50 ownership. And Tim Dugan, who's a managing partner at Water Street, was like, "What? You're working at a company now with 85,000 employees, and BioClinic at the time, I think we had 1,500." And he's like, "Can you go back to a small company?" And I said, "Well, if you look at Icon, it was smaller than that. It was 450 people. It grew up to over 10,000 when I left." And so I think, you don't forget those experiences of what it's like to work in a smaller organization. And, your comment about diving in, when you're in a smaller company, you have to be ready to dive in because you don't have the scale and the number of people to necessarily spread the work out. And so you end up, wearing a few more hats and doing a few more things. So, yeah, BioClinica was a great experience. I mean, to me, it was sort of a diamond in the rough, and it just needed to kind of be reinvigorated, some additional marketing. We had a good leadership team, and we had a very successful period of time and exit. Then it was sold to ERT to become Clario, and I still talk to colleagues there who worked with me at BioClinica before they merged with ERT, and they're just doing great.
yeah.
So that feels good, to
Yeah.
say, okay, I was there when we again put in a really strong foundation, and now the company's continued to grow and expand and become part of a larger organization.
So, John, there was no cruising in your career. It wasn't like you were just hanging out in a company, got it set up, and it's like, okay, I'm going to just sit back now and let this unfold. So, I want to just go back in time a bit. Were you an overachiever as a kid? Like what were you like growing up? Where did you grow up and what were you like as a kid?
So my wife Jean says I'm a border collie. So I get restless. It's like I come in, I like to solve problems, and then if I feel like things are good, I don't generally try to like rest on my laurels because I do like the stimulation, I do like the activity. Um, I if I showed you a picture of what I looked like as a kid, you wouldn't think it was me. I looked totally different.
Really?
I was a little chubby kid growing up, and fortunately, I had a good growth in adolescence. So I grew like 7 inches in one year, and it completely it was a metamorphosis. I changed so much in terms of physical looks and stature and everything else. But I would say, I was always a good student. I always, wanted to get good grades and focused on my studies. I really got into research. I loved research. I loved science. I was fortunate during college to be part of a group that was doing primate neurobiology for the space program for NASA Ames Research Center in California in Moffett Field. And that just really got me going. That's when I really said, I'm going to go on to get a PhD.
Mm.
Of course, then I thought I was going to be an academic. So that only lasted a while. And then, I headed over to the pharmaceutical industry. But that was, I think that, those are sort of, when I look back now, it's sort of critical time points and things that altered my trajectory. I think that experience really got me serious about, wanting to be in research and it gave new meaning to biostatistics and organic chemistry. And, because now all of a sudden I had this focal point of wanting to go to graduate school and I had to make sure I had, really, really good grades and good GRE scores. And so that all worked out. I went to graduate school. I went to University of Tennessee for my PhD, and people always go, "Well, why did you go there?" And I said, "Well, first of all, I didn't have any debt when I graduated, and I didn't have any debt when I graduated from my graduate education. And two of my professors at Santa Clara went there, and they're the ones that actually said." Because initially I hadn't applied there, and they said, "Well, why aren't you applying there?" And I said, "Well, I didn't really know much about the school." So I went there to visit. I got a chance to meet a professor who I ended up getting my PhD under, who had just come there after doing a fellowship with Bernard Leon, who was an electrophysiologist at Harvard Medical School and the Department of Nutrition. And so as soon as I talked to him, it was like, okay, this is where I'm going to go. I like
Yeah.
this. So that worked out really well. So I was there till 1983. And then we moved to Texas, where I was a fellow, National Institute of Health fellow in cardiology and autonomic pharmacology at the University of Texas Medical School.
So when you think back on all these leadership roles, what, John, do you think was really the most gratifying, if you could name one or two things? And what was the absolute most challenging?
Well, the most gratifying, and it just continues, which is really great, is that the people who I've worked with over the years, who were part of my organization, whether it was BioClinica or Icon or Pfizer, a number of them have gone on to really senior roles at other companies. And, it's like your lineage, right? It's like, who's your dad? Who's your grandfather? And so, to see those individuals be really successful and carry on some of the things that we did, that worked. Some things didn't work and they didn't carry those on, but the ones that
Yeah.
worked, it's gratifying. It's really, really gratifying. And to keep up with them. And, I still talk to a number of them. And some of them, the ones that reported to me directly, are now getting to that place in their career where they're thinking about, okay, what do I want to do in the next 5 years? If I decide I want to retire, or if I semi-retire, what opportunities are open to me? So, it's really nice to be able to give back in that way and mentor people. And I've always enjoyed that. Now it's more of a full-time part of my career, but that's been great. And I think the hardest thing, the absolute hardest thing by far, was the turnaround at Pfizer, because
Mm.
we had so many things we were trying to do at the same time. And, I feel like, and I actually, someone there said this, so I feel also gratified by that, which is that some of the work that we put in place during that period of time, excuse me, enabled them to really do what they needed to do for the COVID vaccine. That
Wow.
they had a certain number of areas of foundation, and of course they added on to that dramatically after I left. And but we worked with them at Signet Health. We were the provider for the ECOA, and Icon helped was the CRO that worked with them, and Sama did some work with them on using AI to resolve queries. So it was great to see this kind of all come together on a strong quality foundation, because
Interesting.
to me, that was the key. That strong quality foundation allowed them to really do some extremely innovative things to accelerate that development to basically 9 months, which, you know, no one thought was really possible. So to see that happen was just, that made me feel really good too.
So you are probably the one person I know who is uniquely qualified to have a very broad perspective on the CRO industry and the evolution of the industry because you saw it in the very, very early days. So, can you talk a little bit about the origins and also how are things different now? And how has it evolved?
So, this is the amazing thing to look back at how the industry has changed and evolved and grown. I mean, it's just grown so dramatically. And, when we worked with CROs at Hearst, we worked with a lot of the same players, par excel, some players who aren't around anymore, a couple of small niche providers that were in the New Jersey area. And the model we had, it's kind of like we've gone full circle because it was FSP before FSP was
Right.
popularized.
Yeah.
You know, we had a number of people that we had insourced, particularly CRAs. We were doing a lot of work in CNS. We had an Alzheimer's program and a schizophrenia program, and so there was a local. I'll really date myself here. So Mike Miner was president of Acer Excel, and
Okay.
T.Y. Lee was the
Yeah.
CEO.
I
This goes
I I
way
remember
back.
Mike Miner, so, you're
Yeah.
we're we're both, going way back now.
So they just had this really great small company. TY was a statistician, so they had a really great stats group. We used their statistician, and so we insourced a lot of these people, but we also worked with them in more of a full service outsourcing, depending on the asset, whether we wanted to keep tighter control of it. But it was so much smaller scale, than today, and so to see how the industry has diversified, how it's expanded, how it's added technology. It's just been amazing to watch. And, I think Icon did a great job. I mean, we had our own system, Iconic, and, we realized really early on, in fact, before I got there, even with Bill, that you needed to have a good clinical trial management system. You had to have good visibility on what was going on with the study so that if you got called by a sponsor, you weren't running around looking for a lot of paper. You had that data. So, this is where the industry started, and then it's evolved. Now, I get asked all the time about models. Which model is it? You know, full service outsourcing. Outsourcing, is it FSP? Is it hybrid? And I think no matter what model you use, you can make it work. I think the culture of the company, the philosophy of the company, how much control you want to have, those are the critical things that you need to decide before you go either way. With an FSP model, you tend to have a higher level of much higher level of oversight. You're using your own systems, your own process, your own technologies. So it is really an insourcing model of resources, of CRAs, of data managers, of study managers, and so on. If you are challenged to have a smaller internal footprint, then outsourcing full service, if you have the right partners and you have the right structure and the right governance and quality standards and data, those things can work too. They're challenging though. I mean, when we did it at Pfizer, we did it very fast because we were under pressure to make the change quickly. And it took a few years for it to sort of settle out. And we had bumps along the way. There's no doubt. But I've seen bumps along the way when you migrate back the other way too. So it's having the attention to detail that you need to have with a partner, coming together and really understanding the objectives and the goals, being transparent about sharing information. Goes back to what we talked about earlier with regard to the portfolio. And we used to have, the adage, this came from Bill Taft, no surprises. We don't want surprises. As a pharmaceutical development head, I didn't want surprises. As a CRO president, I didn't want surprises. I wanted visibility and transparency. Even if it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to hear, I'd rather hear it like when it happened rather than somebody trying to, well, maybe we can make it a little better and then we'll tell John. No, tell me right when it happens, and hopefully, I didn't try not to be overreactive, but it just helps you be prepared when you have to have conversations, either internally or externally, around a project.
Yeah. I had a similar conversation with Deirdre Bavard in the last episode about just the fundamentals of good communication, setting expectations, and how that's sort of the foundation for and everything else follows. And John, you had said that the early CRO founders were visionaries, and in some ways they were making bold moves because they were introducing things that had not been sort of done before in clinical trial execution. Do you think that it's harder now to make those bold moves given the current environment?
I think I think it is more challenging because of the scale of a lot of those companies. Pivoting a model, and I always use Kodak as an example of businesses that became very successful based on a certain platform, but then the environment changed dramatically. We started to move away from film and really move more to digital, and how they waited too long to pivot, and by the time they pivoted, they were already in trouble. And I think that the challenge for the big CROs today, and even some of the smaller mid-sized CROs today, is to try to anticipate, what is the industry going to look like 10 years from now? And, a lot of things will be the same. A lot of things I think will have evolved for a variety of reasons. It could be related to the administration and pressures from the environment, pressures around pricing. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to create opportunities and challenges for the industry to evolve to that next level. And I think the companies that see that and recognize it and make the appropriate changes will sustain, and the ones that don't, will be challenged. And, we've seen a lot of CROs that were big CROs at the time, in that sort of 1990 to early 2000 period, kind of disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the ones that have made it are really good, have a great foundation, good leadership. But now, we've got different kinds of challenges. And so I think they really need to also, an ACRO was put together for that too. And ACRO has evolved also very nicely in terms of a consortium for the CRO leadership to come together. And also not just CROs anymore, because BioClinica joined as the very first sort of tech-enabled provider. And then, others have come on board, Medidata. We had at the time ERT, now it's Clario. So, I think that can help kind of stimulate, okay, where do we need to go next? What are the things that are going to actually stick? And then how will that shape the way the industry moves forward? So I think innovation still has to happen. It might have been a little bit easier when you're smaller. And certainly, if you're not a large public company, it makes it a little bit easier to be more nimble in making changes. When you're a large public company, it takes more time and you have to be very, very thoughtful about the move you make.
Yes. And when it comes to innovation adoption by pharma and biotech companies,
Yes.
um, let's talk about that for a minute because, I've been interviewing entrepreneurs and founders, and one of the themes is that it's just very difficult to be an innovator right now in this industry. And um, how do you characterize that? And why is adopting new ways of working so hard within the pharma companies?
Well, there's this tension, I guess, between innovation and risk aversion. And, there is a desire to innovate. There's a strong desire to innovate. I mean, former colleague of mine was just promoted into a position at Pfizer around AI. Okay. So I think that the challenge becomes, how much risk are you willing to take, right? That's kind of the equation, because there's innovation, and as you're innovating, there is risk. I've seen it happen personally because I've innovated and there's been risk with it, and sometimes it works perfectly, and sometimes it doesn't work so great, and then you have to adjust. And there's a certain amount of professional risk that goes with that. And so people are cautious, particularly people who've been in their job in the industry or companies for a long time. They don't want to be, you know, too risky in terms of things they adopt, but they also realize they need to innovate and do things differently. And I think if you're an entrepreneur, and you're an entrepreneur, I know a number of entrepreneurs out there, and I get these calls where it's like, well, this is the best thing. They should just, this should be an automatic no-brainer. Why are we having trouble? And I said, because you're a little company. And so that's a risk. So you have a great idea, no doubt, but you're a little company, and that's a risk. So when you look at the risk ratio, it might be that's a great idea. And if it is a good idea, more people will adopt it and you'll get bigger as a company. And when you get to a certain size, then we'll be interested because we'll know that you have sustainability and you can make it. So I get that. I understand that. And it's one of those things that you have to have intestinal fortitude, right? You have to believe in what you're doing and try to stay with it, and then look for the opportunities because they're there, right? There are people who are change agents. There are people who are early adopters. There are companies that are early adopters. You have to find those, and you have to be able to, share together the benefit of that, new approach, new technology, all of those things. But it is challenging, and it's not an automatic. And I used to tell people the problem is pilot hell. So, no one ever gets in trouble for saying, well, we're piloting that. We're going to pilot that and we're going to see how it goes. And then we're going to pilot the pilot to see how that goes. And, eventually it's like somebody has to say, okay, enough pilots now. Let's do this. Let's go.
Yes.
And I'll tell you a real quick funny story. So when we were, getting ready to make this massive change at Pfizer from FSP to full service outsourcing and reducing the footprint of development, I was at an airport with Emilio Emini, who was the head of vaccines. And we were talking about all this, and he's finally said to me, he goes, let's just do it. And we did. And, it moved forward. We had a couple of bumps along the way, but, I applaud him because, he was the head of vaccines. He had vaccine R&D end to end, including full development. And for him to say, well, let's just do it. I'm like, wow, Emilio, thank you. Because then it sort of, it created a little bit of a critical mass with the organization to say, all right, let's go. Let's move this forward now. and and see where we go. But if you're an innovator, you got to find those people who can be supportive of that new approach, because there's always going to be, naysayers, or, we used to laugh because we would say, if somebody is in pharma and says, we shouldn't advance that drug, they're going to be right most of the time, because the failure rate of innovative medicines is high. So if you're just looking about your own career and not, damaging your own career, you're better to vote no than to vote yes. Because if you vote yes and it fails, well, the likelihood is that it will probably fail, since it's only like 10% of the drugs that make it all the way through. So, but those aren't the people who innovate.
And I love the let's just do it mentality and,
Yeah.
and energy, because let's face it, we as an industry, we are still too slow, and uh, clinical trials are too expensive. And so I really, really like that. John, you and Jean have traveled all over the world, right? So
Yes.
I mean, that's part of the reason it took so long to get you on this podcast. So what just name a couple of the places you've been, and what is your absolute favorite place that you have traveled to?
So our absolute favorite in-country place is probably Botswana in Africa. Um, it's magical. It's really it's transformational. You're out on this safari 4-wheel drive, and usually we do it just by ourselves with a guide, and there's nobody. It's just animals, and behind a corner you could find a lioness and 4 cubs, and that's what happened. We were literally tracking a female lion. The guide said he'd seen her with 4 cubs, and so this was our second trip. So we'd stop, we'd get out, we'd look at the paw prints. We kind of judge which direction they were going. We get back in, and we're driving really slow, and they have these huge termite mounds that sometimes have like a tree or a bush sticking out of them. And Jean said, if I was a lioness, I'd go behind one of those, because, it's shaded, it was starting to get pretty hot. And the termite mounds, a lot of times, warthogs will burrow in, and there's usually a den that you can put your cubs in and stuff. We went around the corner, she was right there.
Wow.
And she was laying on her back. She was obviously exhausted, and the 4 little cubs were running around. And, we sat there for like an hour just watching them and taking pictures, and it was magical. I mean, it was really neat. And so that's certainly, one of our top 3. And the other place we just came back from that we love is the South Pacific, Tahiti. And just because the water is just unbelievable, and we like to snorkel. And so, I spend 70% of my time when we're there in the water, because it's just so great. And the water is 85 degrees, so it's pretty comfortable. So that would be in the top 3. And then the third one, I think Asia. I really like Asia a lot. And we spent time in Korea, and in the southern part of Okinawa, and Vietnam, and Philippines. It was really neat. So yeah, those I'd say kind of our 3. And then we certainly always love Europe and that kind of thing. But I did, as both with BioClinica and Pfizer and Icon, I traveled a lot. And so I saw a lot of these places, but not like you see them when
Right.
you're on vacation. So, I've been to Europe a ton, spent a lot of time in Ireland. We love Ireland, but went there a lot, UK. So Asia, I think, carries a special kind of uniqueness that we really like. So I'd say, yeah, first would be Africa, then the South Pacific, and then, Asia.
Well, John, you've given me so much great advice from a business standpoint over the years, and now I'm going to be calling you for travel advice and tips and tricks, because I love hearing about all your adventures. I have one last question. I feel like I know the answer to this question, but it actually might be a challenging question for you to answer. But what do you think is your superpower?
I think my superpower is, and I've heard this from other people, so I think it's validated, but I tend to be pretty resilient and I don't panic. And when you're in, in development and particularly in development operations, you can't panic because things do go wrong. I mean, you're dealing with human beings, and I always look at a situation and say, look, if as long as nobody died, we can fix this problem. It might take money, might take time, but it's fixable. And ideally, I like to avoid those happening, but they do happen, and you can't freak out. You have to be calm. And I look back at a lot of experiences over the years, where somebody made a mistake, and it was a well-intended error, but it resulted in a problem. And to be able to go into that situation with a solution and a timeline, and this is how we're going to address this. um, it makes dealing with the situation so much easier than if you start yelling and freaking out. And I owe some of this to doing martial arts for the last 25 years, because you do take a minute to sort of center yourself and say, okay, let me think about how I'm going to address this. It's not to say I don't get mad. I do get mad. I mean, plenty of people will tell you that I've read them the riot act, but I try not to try to stay focused and calm and dealing with the problem, as opposed to frenetically, waving my arms and running around in circles. If that's your personality, that's not a good job to go into clinical development operations, because,
Yeah,
things happen. And yeah, I think that's served me. That's my superpower.
I could totally see that. I think it's also a great leadership trait. I'll just hold up a mirror, because when I was thinking of the question, the word that came up for me about you is you have incredible empathy. And the reason I say that is because well, just as you described, if there's a problem and somebody was the source of that problem, you're also understanding that they're probably not feeling great, that they were the cause of the chaos. And, but more than that, I just see how you've been such a great mentor to so many people in the industry, to me, certainly, and just the way that you get involved in everything that you sort of set your mind to. It's just with this sort of undercurrent of empathy, and I really, really appreciate that about you, John. And
Thank-
I just wanna thank you so much for being on this podcast and for being such a great friend to me for so many years.
No, Patty, I've really enjoyed it. And it's great to be able to keep in touch with everybody and just see how everybody's careers have, progressed. And the comment about empathy, I do. I really try to understand when something happens. You know, if the person's incompetent, that's one thing. But a lot of times people are very competent, very capable, and maybe they're overwhelmed, or maybe, something happened. And so to try to be human about
Yes.
a situation. And I think, as long as I've been able to maintain that, I can sleep well at night. So
Yeah.
but
Well,
thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and hopefully there's been some nuggets in the conversation.
great conversation. Thanks again, John.